Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. In the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the Ohio River wasn't just a feature on the natural landscape. It wasn't even just a border between Kentucky and Ohio. It was the border between slavery and freedom. And every time an enslaved person risked everything to seize freedom by crossing this river, they reenacted the whole American story. Now there's a group of Cincinnatians who want to build a National Underground Railroad Freedom Center right there at the end of the suspension bridge on the Cincinnati side. During this past week, I sat down with the president and CEO of that organization, Ed Rigaud, to talk about the goals and strategies to develop that organization. Here's the interview. Ed, the most basic question that an organization like this has to focus on right from the beginning is, what's your ultimate goal for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center?
Dan, this institution is intended to teach the lessons of history and attempt to reapply them today. I mean, that's the simple mission of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And I'm talking about lessons of courage and cooperation between people of different races. I'm talking about the importance of the quest for freedom in this country. You know, those very important lessons about freedom, and see if we can't use those to bring people together today. So it's about healing and it's about racial reconciliation. I've often been asked, what is the target audience? The target audience to me is all people who are hopeful. All people who are hopeful that they can overcome oppression and achieve full freedom. Overcome separation and achieve togetherness. And so that applies not only to people in the U.S., we definitely want to have as visitors our friends from Canada who have a very important role in this history. But we also want to have people from Europe or South America or from all over the globe, many of whom have experienced in their history similar Underground Railroad movements.
Well, Ed, why in this whole thing, with all the stories about American history that you could focus on, are you focusing on the story of the Underground Railroad?
Well, it's because it is perhaps the first multiracial civil rights movement in this country. Certainly the first significant one. And we think there's a lot to be learned from that.
The story of the Underground Railroad is filled with myths. There are stories about tunnels under the river that you could point to out of your window here. There are stories about secret tunnels and funny rooms in the basement of houses. How are you going to separate the reality from the myth? How are you going to make sure you're telling a real story here?
Well, first of all, let me address the whole question, the whole notion of myths and legend, because in actuality, during the Underground Railroad period, some of the myths were very important to the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad. I mean, the people in the South who were, by and large, pro-slavery were concerned and in some cases frightened by this Underground Railroad because it had these myths associated with it. It was viewed as something much more powerful than it actually was. And so it had, I think, more of an influence than it might have otherwise had. So the myths are important in that sense. However, it's also very important that we separate the myth from the reality as best we can. And we've dedicated ourselves to that, to looking for original documentation wherever we can on the stories that we're going to tell at the Freedom Center. But there will also be a place for telling about the myths and the legends. And in some cases, those are going to be more fun to tell about than the true stories. But we'll make sure that they're positioned that way.
You know, one of the most popular museums in the past couple of years to come online was the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. How do you imagine the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center relating to or being similar to or different from the Holocaust Museum?
The mission of the Holocaust Museum is never again. It is to remind people that this is an atrocity, this is a horrible thing that should never happen again. Our mission is almost the reverse. It's, let's do it again. Let's get people across racial lines to cooperate against an objective of what's right for this country and bring people together. So our missions are quite different. The approach that the Holocaust Museum uses to get its message across is very effective, and we think something that we should model. We think this is really, the Freedom Center is a part of a new genre of museums, if you will, that have been referred to as museums of conscience or museums of reflection, which are not simply static displays or artifacts, but attempt to give the individual visitor a feeling for the history and a sense of how the history relates to contemporary life. So we want people to not only understand intellectually what the Underground Railroad was about, we want them to feel it, to experience it. So in that sense, we're more than a museum. Our programs are going to be directed that way. Our exhibitry will be directed that way. For example, our exhibits will be multimedia exhibits for the most part, rather than art or objects or collections. These multimedia story theaters will impact people in the heart so that they get a sense of what really went on, so that they can feel what the slave felt during escape, so they can feel what the conductor felt helping a slave and taking the risk of property and prestige in their own community.
Obviously, this isn't just about people coming and walking through a couple of exhibits for an hour or 2 hours.
I like to think of the museum visit as being the first spark. This is where we're going to get people to recognize that this is an important subject and it deserves more study and more attention. And so our programs then are the most important thing that happen in order to educate people. For example, and we haven't designed all the programs yet. We're just in the early process of designing programs, but one of the ones that we've made some progress on is educational program for youth, 3rd through 8th graders, where we will attempt to get young students to explore the history, do research themselves, present their findings, and to be transformed themselves by their own study, to really begin to get an appreciation for the backgrounds of someone who is different from them. And that's both black and white youth who don't know this history. This is going to open a whole new avenue for them, a whole avenue of thought.
There are literally thousands of sites in North America, not only in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico, that identify with the Underground Railroad. Now, how's this National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in one place, in Cincinnati, going to relate to all of these other sites all over the country and all over the continent?
As part of our mission, we think of ourselves as being a distributive museum. In that, I mean we're going to reach out electronically and programmatically to all of the other sites around the country. There were 29 states involved in the Underground Railroad. And there are lots of interested parties around this country who want to be part of this commemoration and this inspiration that our Freedom Center will provide. It's important that we do it here because this was, in fact, a very, very important central part of the activity. It's been estimated that over half of the slaves may have escaped across the Ohio, in the Ohio River corridor at some point, not just in Cincinnati, but in other parts of Ohio, like Ripley, Ohio, which is well known for its Underground Railroad activity, or beyond. And so We do have a kind of a special place in this history, but we're not the only place. We'd like to consider ourselves to be full partners with all of those other sites, so that people coming from those sites can get the big picture of what the Underground Railroad was when they visit the Freedom Center in Cincinnati. But we can also send people out. People may not be aware of their own area's importance in the Underground Railroad. We want to make them aware of that, so when they go back to their communities, they have a better appreciation for what happened in their neighborhoods.
You know, we've been talking about the story of slavery, of enslaved peoples escaping slavery, of African Americans in the North helping runaways. Does this turn out to be a black museum?
No, not by any means. This is a museum which uncovers a history of a race of people that has largely been ignored. And in a large sense, this is what I think is preventing us from having the dialogue that the president talks about wanting to have about race. We have a reticence, both blacks and whites, in talking about slavery. The Underground Railroad offers the positive possibility of laying this subject of race on the table and examining it in a productive way. And so I think potentially the Freedom Center holds the key to opening up that dialogue. It's not a black-white situation, and it's not a black-only Freedom Center. It's a human subject that we're addressing, where race has gotten in the way of addressing, and slavery has gotten in the pain of slavery has gotten in the way of us opening up that dialogue.
How long is it going to take before people in Cincinnati and from any place else are going to be able to actually see something on the riverfront, actually walk into a Freedom Center down there?
We're working very hard to open the center in the spring of 2003. This is very ambitious. You know, an institution of this type typically takes 9 years. The Holocaust Museum took 17 years in the making. But we think we have a shot of doing this. And it will be on the Central Riverfront, so we're going to depend a lot on everything else happening on the Central Riverfront on time.
Ed, thank you. Hold on just a moment. We have to take a break, but we'll be right back. Stay tuned. After the break, we'll focus on very practical issues like where this is going to go, how much it's going to cost, and who's going to contribute. Where's this place going to be? I know it's going to be somewhere on the riverfront, but the riverfront, when you look at it right now, is this mass of construction and dirt being pushed around and things being torn down. Where do you imagine the Freedom Center fitting into all of that?
The way to think about this is if you were coming across the suspension bridge from Covington, coming into Cincinnati, when you got to the very end of the landing of the suspension bridge, you would be sitting right on the property where we will be built. Another way to look at it is it's between Vine and Walnut, Pete Rose Way, and the new 2nd Street that will be formed once Fort Washington Way is narrowed. Once the Fort Washington Way is narrowed, there's then the question of building garages in the trench. That's also important to the Freedom Center, not only because part of that parking garage system will service the Freedom Center, but also atop that garage is a platform on which the Freedom Center will be built to keep it out of the floodplain.
One of the big concerns about the riverfront is you're going to have this mammoth Bengal stadium over here, and then you're going to have a Red Stadium off to the east. How are you going to make sure that something like the Freedom Center isn't going to get lost between these two great big structures?
Well, you might think so. However, we've talked to several architects about that, and while they were initially concerned about the mass from the stadiums dwarfing what we're doing, as they looked at the situation, particularly with the Reds being moved from current Synergy location down east a bit more, they see some real possibilities to still make the Freedom Center a jewel, an attractive jewel for the city, and to not have it be dwarfed by the stadia. I haven't seen actual renderings as yet because there aren't any, but they've got some ideas that are pretty intriguing that should work.
Since you're committing to the riverfront, are you going to be unhappy if the Reds end up on Broadway?
It would, I think, certainly be great to have the baseball down there and attract a lot of people so that they can experience being there and maybe want to go to the museum on some other day. But I don't think it's essential. I really don't think. I think we can make this work with either scenario, and that's why I've remained neutral on that subject.
Been a lot of things talked about for the riverfront, and a lot of concerns about how that relates to the Freedom Center. How does the idea of a park, which is being talked about a lot right now, a fairly large park, how does that fit in to the Freedom Center's plans?
I think that's a terrific idea. That's one of the ideas I have reacted to very favorably, and indeed made some significant contribution to that idea being generated in the first place. One of our architectural consultants, Harry Robinson, held a charrette about this time last year, and one of the proposals coming out of that charrette was for parkland for a grand civic place on the Central Riverfront. And while others had similar ideas, I think Harry Robinson's charrette kind of brought some substance to that. I have been very, very supportive and continue to work with the Park Board on that whole idea because it's very compatible with what we're doing. One of the things we'd like to do is integrate into that parkland a trail, kind of an adventure trail from the river to the Freedom Center. So you can start enjoying the experience of the Freedom Center right from the riverfront all the way to the building.
What's the total cost?
Our estimate is somewhere between $80 and $90 million, and that figure includes the cost of the facility itself, as well as a substantial endowment to keep the programs running. We've recently completed a feasibility study to determine if we can raise that amount of money, and I'm extremely pleased to say that there's a high level of confidence based on that study, a very detailed study, that we can raise that amount. We're actually mapping out our fundraising strategy now. At least half of the money will be private, and we're thinking that a very good portion of it, up to half, will be national. So think of it as out of, call it 90 million, at least 45 million will be raised privately. We had originally thought we could raise a higher percentage from private sources, but that doesn't look possible.
What about local support from local government, city, the county? What are they going to contribute to this?
The city has pledged $6 million, and they've already released $1 million of that. It's going to be done on an annual basis at about $1 million a year. We've asked the county to take on that responsibility, and I think they will consider that favorably.
You know, as I do some quick calculations, you know, 6 or 6.5 million from the city, 6.5 million from the county, 15 hopefully from the state. I think that adds up to about 27, and you said you need about 45 from public sources. There's still quite a gap there.
Yeah, and that's going to have to come federal.
There's been a lot of information in the paper lately with headlines about this Network to Freedom Act being passed by the federal government, by Congress. Now, is that the source of the money for a federal contribution to the Freedom Center? Actually,
no, Dan. The funding that's been applied to that bill is $500,000 annually to the Department of Interior for the National Park Service to carry out its function of linking sites around the country and preserving sites. That is precious little money to do that job. It's not enough money to do the full job. And so there will be little, if any, funding coming directly through the National Park Service to the Freedom Center. I was actually referring to some other possibilities. For example, in the education department, there's an opportunity to do programming like we were talking about for youth, to teach them some skills, teach them research skills, teach them presentation skills. And the subject of the Underground Railroad is a perfectly legitimate subject to do that. But we've just begun that exploration into all of the possibilities for federal funding.
You know, your background is as a chemist and coming out of management at Procter & Gamble. What's it been like to move over into this museum world and try to figure this whole other phase, a whole business out?
I love this museum stuff. This, you didn't tell me how fun this was. It really is growthful, and it really opens your eyes. And I think part of it is history and art. Those subjects, well, art's always been dear to me. History hasn't. It's a newfound love for me that really opens up your humanness. And I'm hoping that the Freedom Center will do that for a lot of people who haven't caught on to the importance of history. I don't think, as an individual who doesn't have a history history museum background, that I can do all that needs to be done for the Freedom Center. So we organizationally have plans in place that will put in people who really know this business. I mean, it's a business, and it's got its own special expertise that really takes years and years to develop.
One of the interesting things about the whole support for the Freedom Center over the last few years in Cincinnati is that Procter & Gamble came forward very early, not only with a significant $3 million financial contribution, but by making you available on loan for a long period of time. Why does P&G see this, and why might other corporations see this as a useful thing to be involved with?
This really goes back to the origin of the project, and you know, it was a national conference of Christians and Jews, Chip Herod, who had this initial idea, and who came to the corporate world to find the person to run it. He's the one who approached Procter & Gamble and asked for me to be put on loan to do this work. John Pepper, who runs Procter & Gamble, sparked to the idea because he was farsighted enough to be able to see that ultimately this is going to help Cincinnati, and it's going to help the corporations because of its mission. I was reminded of this the other day, and someone mentioned that corporations are trying to build teams, multifunctional, multidisciplinary, multiracial, multi-ethnic teams. So diverse teams that know how to work together. And this person who reminded me of this said, you know, what better example of diverse people cooperating than the Underground Railroad? So I think John Pepper, in his wisdom, sees that this can open up some new areas of thought and action between diverse groups of people, while at the same time making Cincinnati a much better place to live in, much more attractive place, much more tolerant place, and actually change attitudes in the community.
Okay, thank you very much. We covered a lot.